We have Tracy K. Smith here tonight, which is such a pleasure. I did not know, as I mentioned, that you were just a stone's throw away, and so we're glad that you're here tonight. Tracy K. Smith is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, memoirist, editor, translator, and librettist who served as our 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019. Her most recent books are Such Color, New and Selected Poems, and My Name Will Grow Wide Like a Tree, selected poems of Yi Lei, co-translated with Chang Tae Bi. She's a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and a professor of English and of African American Studies at Harvard. The Chicago Review of Books on her selected poems has said, "This book is an unflagging, accretive wave after wave of simultaneously grounded and transcendent content." And Victoria Chang has said, "When I'm done reading, I feel a collective haze of excellence, and yet we're not done reading." Tracy K. Smith.
Thank you. So kind of you. Thanks for coming out this evening. It's really exciting. The last time I was here, I was an undergraduate sitting in the audience, feeling like, oh, I want poetry to claim me. So it feels really meaningful to be here, still in the community of people who need and believe in what poetry offers. We were talking, just in the little passing conversations I had waiting to start, I found myself kept referring to time, the time we're in, the time that began in 2020, the way it's so difficult to remember where we have been and for how long and what things used to be like. So maybe I'll start at least by reading some poems that are thinking about time. I'll admit that I'm turning to poems that I wrote probably thinking about entering midlife, thinking about what that meant, what mortality meant, also what it means to live in the 21st century, having such deep, vivid, fond longings for our analog existence before now. So this poem bears witness to that. Am I doing well with this microphone? This is called Annunciation. I feel ashamed, finally, of our magnificent paved roads, our bridges slung with steel, our vivid glass, our tantalizing lights, everything enhanced, rehearsed, a trick. I've turned old. I ache most to be confronted by the real, by the cold, the pitiless, the bleak, by the red fox crossing a field after snow, by the broad shadow scraping past overhead. My young son, eyes set at an indeterminate distance, ears locked, tuned inward, caught in some music only he has ever heard. Not our cars, our electronic haze, not the piddling bleats and pings that cause some hearts to race. Ashamed, like a pebble, hard and small, hoping only to be ground to dust by something large and strange and cruel. My daughter is going to turn 13 next week. This is a poem written just a handful of years ago when she felt like a new being at that time, different from the baby, and totally different and almost foreign to me now, looking back. What would she say if she were going to introduce, me? She would be like, my mother is a foreign country, I don't know. This poem is called Dusk. And over the years, I often feel that in solidarity with my students, it's sometimes important to do some of the exercises that I assign to them. And this is one such poem. It began with our reading and talking about a poem by C.K. Williams called The Cup, in which the speaker, who is an adult remembering his own adolescence, talks about how irate the sight of his mother made him in the morning as she sipped her first few sips of coffee. And he is big enough to realize before the end of the poem that this is a poem about something that's going on with him as opposed to her. So my students and I wrote poems that looked at another person and became or revealed themselves to be self-portraits. So this is my response. Dusk. What woke to war in me? Those years when my daughter had first grown into a solid, self-centered self. I'd watch her sit at the table. Well, not quite sit. More like stand on one leg while the other knee hovered just over the chair. She wouldn't lower herself, as if there might be a fire or a great black blizzard of waves let loose in the kitchen, and she'd need to make her escape. No, she'd trust no one but herself, her own new, lean, always jittering legs to carry her. Where exactly? Where would a child go? To there alone. She'd rest one elbow on the table, the opposite one to the bent leg skimming the solid, expensive, tasteful chair. And even though we were together, her eyes would go half dome, shades dropped like a screen at some cinema the old aren't let into. I thought I'd have more time. I thought my body would have taken longer, going about the inevitable feat of repelling her. But now, I could see even in what food she left untouched, food I'd bought and made and all but ferried to her lips. I could see how it smacked of all that had grown slack and loose in me. Her other arm would wave the fork around just above the surface of the plate, casting about for the least possible morsel, the tiniest grain of unseasoned rice. She'd dip into the food like one of those shoddy metal claws, poised over a valley of rubber bouncing balls, the kind that lifts nothing or next to nothing and drops it in the chute. The narrow, untouched hips, the shoulders still so naive as to stand squared, erect, impervious, facing the window open onto the darkening dusk. It's what I've found in my work is that turning toward history is a way of trying to glean something, what I describe as newly useful, that might help me deal with the uncertainty that I live with in the present, or the apprehension, or just the knowledge of where we're likely heading. And so history has kind of made itself at home in my poetry over the last couple of books. Maybe I will read you a poem called The Greatest Personal Privation. And it's a found poem that derives from correspondence written by a slaveholding family called the Joneses, the Charles Colcock Joneses. And this is the story. They held a family enslaved to them. There were two members of this family that were, initially like devoted servants assigned or tasked with serving Mary Jones, who was the matriarch of this family. And then there came a time years later when one of the daughters in this family group began to run away or present herself as free, and she began to cause a lot of consternation for this family. They wanted to figure out what to do before this family gave other, enslaved people ideas about what they could get away with. And so there are many months of letters that they wrote back and forth, family member to family member, trying to figure out what they were going to do to resolve this problem. Many years earlier, Mary and Charles Jones had written a number of letters trying to figure out if they really felt that slavery was okay. Charles Colcock Jones was a Presbyterian minister, and like many people, dealt with a sense of conflicted conscience about, holding people captive, essentially. And like many people, over time, they developed a really good rationale for what they were doing, and so sort of redoubled their efforts. This poem opens with an epigraph from one letter that Mary Jones wrote to her cousin, Elizabeth, while she was convalescing far from home from an illness. And at that time, she said, "The greatest personal privation I have had to endure has been the want of either Patience or Phoebe. Tell them I am never, if life is spared us, to be without both of them again." It's a chilling promise to imagine being on the receiving end of. As you can imagine, there aren't a lot of letters. I think there's one letter that is in the archive of this family's correspondence that was written by one of the Black family members, after having been sold away eventually, and found contact with someone, and it was just it was an update. Like, this is what so-and-so is doing, this is who has passed on. Otherwise, we're well. Tell everybody, that we send our regards. I longed for more evidence of their voices and their perspectives on their lives. And my way of trying to move toward that was to listen harder into these letters by the Joneses and imagine that I could hear a current running against the grain of those voices. And so this, I would imagine, is Patience or Phoebe speaking. It is a painful and harassing business belonging to her. We have had trouble enough, have no comfort or confidence in them, and they appear unhappy themselves, no doubt from the trouble they have occasioned. They could dispose of the whole family without consulting us, father, mother, every good cook, washer, and seamstress, subject to sale. I believe good shall be glad if we may have hope of the loss of trouble. I remain in glad conscience, at peace with God and the world. I have prayed for those people many, many, very many times. Much as I should miss Mother, I have had trouble enough and wish no more to be only waiting to be sent home in peace with God. In every probability, we may yet discover the whole country will not come back from the sale of parent and child. So far as I can see, the loss is great and increasing. I know they have desired we should not know what was for our own good, but we cannot be the cause of all that has been done. We wish to act. We may yet, but we have to learn what their character and moral conduct will present. We have it in contemplation to wait and see. If good, we shall be glad. If evil, then we must meet evil as best we can. Father, mother, son, daughter, man. And if that family is sold, please, we cannot, please, we have got to, please, the children, mother and father and husband and all of you, all, I have no more. How soon and unexpectedly cut off, many, many, very many times. I have this belief that time and language, no matter who the language originates from, offers us some sort of on-ramp to truth in some way, as if the intention that might have wrangled language toward some sort of deceptive or self-serving end has lifted off, and we can see with greater clarity what dwells there that's incontrovertible. And I think in some ways that's why I lean toward some of these archival documents, particularly our founding documents, which we like to think of as living documents, because if they're living, perhaps they still have breath and intention and language and conscience to offer. Maybe I'll read two more poems that are found in nature that are erasures, sometimes radical erasures of existing and sometimes familiar texts. So this first one is certainly a familiar text. I'm looking for it in the book, but it's called Declaration, and it's an erasure of the Declaration of Independence. Let me just find what page it's on. I sat down with this thinking that what I was looking for was material that would help me write or revise a poem that was thinking about Thomas Jefferson. I thought maybe if I could dwell with his contribution to this document, I would glean something that would be useful. But then the text itself began to call my attention to things I'd never noticed before. And what I began to hear was this really emphatic declaration of the intersecting, overlapping, parallel terms of grievance that come from the colonists against King George of England, but that also could just as easily fit into the mouths of African Americans. That gives shape to some of the ongoing grievances that emerge from Black life in this country, and that felt startling and useful. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. And I'll shift to a less familiar text, which comes from Woodrow Wilson, who I think in 1924 wrote a celebratory essay on Robert E. Lee. I taught at Princeton for many years, and so Wilson's name graced the School of Public and International Affairs and a residential college, and he was invoked, frequently. In 2014, a group of students urged the president and trustees to remove his name from those places, citing the injustice that he, in some ways, invited into the federal government and into cities, especially in the South, that were sites of a renewed Ku Klux Klan presence after the screening and celebration of the film Birth of a Nation. And so eventually, the summer of 2020, that decision was finally made by Princeton. And that was my last, I was coming toward the end of my time there, and I wanted to mark that decision with a poem. It felt like a victory of sorts. So this is another found poem. It uses language from that essay distilled into something else. Found poem. It is not necessary to recount his achievements, those things done, not done, in order to serve a simple end. I think it says something that it should have taken so short a time for the whole nation to see the true measure of this man's life. If you love a country that does not, was conceived not to want you, I want to remind you, we live. We live. Turn your faces and your hands likewise to the task of life, deep color, ardor of blood. This is a poem called Mothership. My third book, Life on Mars, kind of cleaved to the genre of science fiction, which is, as I see it, another distancing device, or a device by which the present can be contemplated through a different vocabulary, different tropes. And that book was also, it was a way of dealing with some of the anxieties or recalibrating my vocabulary for the anxieties I live with as an American citizen, a nation where much happens in our name that has grave effects. And also, it was a stance that allowed me to think differently about grief, which I was dealing with when I was writing those poems. My father passed away while I was working on that book. I kind of invite that space in because I think this poem is of that ilk in a way, although it's a newer poem. I was close friends with a poet named Camila Aisha Moon. You might know her work. A poet of huge conscience and a really wonderful friend to many of us who passed away last fall. I wrote this poem for her at the time that her mother passed away. And I thought, my mom is gone, Aisha's mom is gone. Maybe it would help both of our hearts to imagine that they've now met each other and they know each other wherever they might find themselves. And that felt good. And then, my imagination pushed a little bit against that idea and said, what if everybody's mother out there finds one another? What's that going to be like? And so this is a space to kind of let that thought experiment happen. Mothership. You cannot see the mothership in space. It and she being made of the same thing. All our mothers hover there in the ceaseless blue-black, watching it ripple and dim to the prized pale blue in which we spin. We who are black, and you too,
Our mothers know each other there, fully and finally. They see what some here see and call anomaly, the way the sight of me might set off a shiver in another mother's son, a deadly, silent digging in, a stolid refusal to budge, the viral urge to stake out what, on solid ground, is authority, and sometimes also territory. Our mothers, knowing better, call it folly.
Soon I will try and bring us to a little bit brighter space, but I'm going to go one more step down. You know how when something's on your mind, you see it everywhere. You see evidence or proof of it everywhere. So summer of 2020, I was thinking about violence against unarmed Black citizens. How awful that we have like a received phrase to describe this recurrent, facet of our life. But that was everywhere. And I was reading the New York Times one morning, and there was an article about elephants in Botswana who were dying as a result of some mysterious illness. And this other field of vision kind of superimposed itself atop this story. So this is another erasure poem. It looks like a fill in the blank poem in the book. I'll mark these blank lines with just a little extra silence. This is called The Elephant in the Poem. Some appeared to have died suddenly, collapsing chest first while walking or running. Experts are left with few clues as to whether the cause is something sinister, such as, or a naturally occurring disease from which the areas will bounce back. As populations grow, it is more likely that you will get mass die-offs, probably on a bigger scale than this. Death comes to all living things. The important thing now is to identify what is causing the deaths. Researchers observed some that appeared disoriented, including one that was walking in circles. Others were dragging their legs as though paralyzed, and still others appeared lethargic and emaciated. Males and females, young and old, all seem equally affected. Many still consider the country a safe haven for. At this point, the deaths do not constitute a crisis. This is a poem that emerged. It was kind of a gift in some ways. I was writing a lot of poems that were drawing me to, witness dark and difficult and heavy parts of history. Most history is dark and heavy. And I was also doing some travel to parts of the South for another project I was working on, and to witness how much of this history is unmarked or has been sort of refashioned as aspects of like the hospitality industry, when really, we're talking about enslavement and labor camps and the buying and selling of people, all of that. I had this just dark cloud that I was moving within. And on the last night of one of these research trips, my collaborator and I went to a ring shout in Georgia, coastal Georgia, and I was just clenched from, just thinking about, the contradictions and the irascibility that we kind of deal with in terms of our American narrative.
And one of the performers walked into the hall where they were going to be doing this ritual, and she saw me and she said, "I love you," and she gave me a hug. And I needed to hear that. I needed a phrase or gesture of care, and I just allowed myself to let everything out. I just lost it. And then this woman, I stood there and I saw her say, "I love you," to the next person and the next person. She said it to every single person. Her name is Bertha McKnight, and I think that is her way. And it could have cheapened what I received, but I actually believe it's a choice that she makes, and it's immense. And it felt so instructive to me. And I wanted to just bring myself back into the presence of that by writing a poem about it. So this is called Wade in the Water. And she's a member of a group called the Geechee Gullah Ring Shouters. And you probably know this, but a ring shout is a tradition that emerges from African American culture during the antebellum period, but it has strong ties to West African rites and religious practices and percussion. And in this country, it involves the spirituals, the familiar songs. Wade in the Water is one, being performed in a circle, and there's a space of this wrapped belonging. And I also believe it's a form of conjuring these others whose living and dying was so essential to our lives, and our what we will do. Wade in the water. And then, sorry, the last thing I'll say is that all of these spirituals have a narrative on the surface. Oftentimes it draws from Old Testament stories, God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt, or God who promises that he will be beside his believers in times of need. The subterranean message is almost always encoded with instructions on how to go about escaping slavery. So the song Wade in the Water, tells the story of an angel that came to trouble the water to the benefit of God's believers. But it also tells somebody who's seeking to escape to freedom to walk in the water so that their tracks won't be as easily, sniffable by slave catchers and their dogs. So it's a really powerful archive of faith, and also this sort of vocabulary of necessity. Wade in the Water. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her, and a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you. I love you," as she continued down the hall, past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. "I love you" throughout the performance, in every hand clap, every stomp. "I love you" in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. "I love you" in the water where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. "I love you," the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes in those beams of light that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel, knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Is this love the trouble you promised? I'll close with one last poem, maybe a stranger poem. This is called Logos. When I was putting this selected poems together, I wanted to, as many of the newer and newer work is thinking about history as it pertains to racial justice, I wanted to make an argument that all of my poems are thinking about that. And so I tried to gather up poems where that might be present and ask them to speak with or sing with this other work. And this is a poem that is not making an argument through logic, which is one version of what logos might mean, but through a sense of the living word, something that is holy, which is the sense of logos that I'm seeking to engage here. Safe in the light along the bank, being in believing, no name, only being. On the bank, radiant and blank, safe, watching and seeing. On the brink of the light, blank, no blame in being. Waiting, then seeing. Breathing in, being. Let my voice on the banks along that brink after the blaze of knowing, that singing. Thank you.